So from what I've gathered, Iceburg videos are meant to explore the greater depths of lore within a particular topic, such as Steven Universe, FNAF, and total drama. Alright, whatever gets views, I guess. But then I thought, why not make one for Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD for short? And as always, I had to give myself a congratulatorial celebration for my sheer brilliance. Even though it's been around for centuries, the research for ASD is still fairly new, and surprise, surprise, I'm bound to miss some things. So miss me with that, you forgot, but actually, no, just add it in the comments, and we can all learn together, okay, Bethany? So starting at the tip, to the abyss, here is my Autism Spectrum Disorder Iceburg Explained. Starting in no particular order, on the surface we have the tip of the iceberg, autism and Asperger's. Autism is a developmental disorder characterized by one's difficulties with social interactions, repetitive behaviors, and communication. Asperger's syndrome, named after Hans Asperger's, is a neurodevelopment disorder characterized by significant difficulties in social interaction and nonverbal communication, along with restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior and interests, often mistaken as non-autistic because the symptoms are more subtle. Now, did what I just say sound very similar to each other? Well, the DSM-5 thought so too, and that's why we just call it Autism Spectrum Disorder, or autism, or being on the spectrum. Umbrella terms. Symptoms. These symptoms are typically recognized as early as the first 2 to 4 years of an autistic child's life. They can also be easily overlooked due to reasons later explained, but for now, the symptoms of ASD may include but are not limited to avoiding eye contact, delay in speech development, unable to read or understand social cues, difficulties interpreting others' emotions, issues with verbal and nonverbal communication, hyperfixation on various topics of interest, special interests, continuously repeating words and phrases, irregular motor skills and behaviors, voluntarily self-isolation, taking everything literally or at face value, resistance of any slight or sudden changes, recurring patterns of behavior, self-stimulation or stimming, such as rocking, bouncing, and or flapping of the arms, that help soothe or show our feelings, sensory sensitivity and sensory overload, where one or more of the 5 senses are overwhelmed and overstimulated or unable to be stimulated, which can lead to autistic shutdowns. Typically, when an autistic person shuts down, they become fully nonverbal for a while, and depending on from autistic person to autistic person, might take some time to start speaking again. Disability or disorder. So autism is classified as a disorder because it hinders normal neurological functions, but ASD is also considered a disability because it causes social, communication, and behavioral challenges, which means autistic people are protected under the Disability Act, at least in the States. So unless we specify, it can be considered both. Curable? No. And there is no cure for being yourself, no matter what BS Elon Musk wants to try. It's also not something that can be prayed away either, so staff it. High and low functioning. Although it was used to explain the range of being on the spectrum, unfortunately a handful of autistic people hate being referred to as either high or low functioning. But for the sake of this video and education, I'm just gonna explain what they mean. High functioning meant an autistic person could pass as, quote-unquote, normal. They have competent social skills and need less support since they pass so well. This was a common label for people diagnosed under Asperger's syndrome. I was constantly called high functioning, but that doesn't change the fact that I still need support every now and again. While low functioning meant the exact opposite. These autistic people need way more support, they usually aren't as verbal and resort to alternative means of communication, and their behaviors have a larger impact on their daily lives. But thanks to the DSM-5, which I'll get there, we avoid using these terms. Now we just categorize it by levels of severity, which I'm getting there. We got a lot to go through, guys. Come on now. I had to make this all on my own. Autism Speaks. If you're looking for accurate information from a loving organization that just wants to help autistic people, then never use Autism Speaks. I know they're the first thing you see when you search up autism or autistic organizations, but keep scrolling. You get over 200 million results for that shit, nigga. Keep searching! Because this nonprofit company tries oh so hard to cure autism through eugenic scare tactics and treats being on the spectrum as if it's some sort of plague. Like, have y'all ever seen their commercials? Shit looks like an anti-drug ad. They make autism out to be like this deadly disease that can be cured. But it's not, and there is no cure for a developmental disorder. The company doesn't help as much as they claim. They spread misinformation and pocket the donations, allegedly. But they still ain't shit. Now I'm gonna talk about some actual organizations that support actual autistic people later on, but just know that Autism Speaks does not speak for autism. The Puzzle Piece, 1963. I'm gonna be quoting a lot of articles, FYI, and paraphrasing some shit, but all my resources will be down below if you guys want to read the full articles. I meant to say that at the beginning, but forgot. The first use of the autism puzzle piece was in 1963. Gerald Gasson, probably saying that hella wrong, a parent and board member for the National Autistic Society in London, created a logo for the organization that consisted of a puzzle piece along with an image of a crying child. Okay, so at the time, these blokes thought of ASD to be a puzzling or mysterious disorder, which made it difficult for autistic children to, fit in. Which explains the symbol, and I think it's kind of clever, honestly. But it also carries a lot of negative connotations since Autism Speaks adapted it for their logo. Suffice to say, not a lot of people on the spectrum are too fond or too pleased with this symbol for autism. Personally, I don't mind it, but again, we'll get there when we get there. The Autism Awareness Rainbow, 1999. The rainbow was adapted in 1999 and meant to be used as the universal sign of autism awareness. But this creation came from the Autism Society, and you can already start to see the issues here. Again, quoting, "The puzzle pattern reflects the complexity of the autism spectrum. The different colors and shapes represent the diversity of the people and families living with the condition. The brightness of the ribbon signals hope. While the attempt to capture the diversity of autistic folks was there, it fell really short because some don't agree with simplifying us as mysterious or puzzles. Rather, we are individuals with unusual behaviors who develop at a different pace than typical people do." Now, personally, and I only speak for myself in this case, I don't mind the puzzle piece. Clearly, it's a large part of my aesthetic if y'all haven't noticed. Because I don't see us as puzzle pieces. Rather, the entire picture that others need to piece together, aka, getting to know us better. It's a metaphor, yo! Some may have more complex pictures or fewer pieces, but ultimately, once that picture is put together, you learn to appreciate us more. I like to think of the puzzles as a metaphor for autism, and that's what I use to explain it to neurotypicals. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but that's just me. The infinity and rainbow symbol. So, sometime later, a different symbol was constructed in hopes of inclusivity for autistic people, either displayed as a solid kind of gray color or a rainbow. And you could assume that the infinity symbol was chosen because, some autistic people enjoy math, but it also showcases that autism has always been around. There is no definitive beginning or end. Now, the added rainbow is meant to reflect the range of ASD symptoms and how every autistic person has their individual challenges living on the spectrum. Personally, I'm not a fan of the rainbow because that's the LGBTQ+ primary symbol. I'd rather the two not get confused as such because this symbol is meant for ASD while the other is meant for gender and sexuality orientations. While you may also have seen the rainbow symbol used for neurodivergent, it's the primary symbol most autistic people prefer, especially compared to the other outdated symbols. Light it up blue. Coined by Autism Speaks to raise awareness, but them being a eugenics group, that symbol is forever trash. How about red instead? Now there's been attempts to update the puzzle with using a butterfly to symbolize the beauty and diversity as well as the continuous changes and development of autism. Now this is something I can get behind. Many organizations such as the UK's National Autistic Society use the clasped hand symbol to represent acceptance for people on the spectrum and their families. But other organizations like the Autism Self-Advocacy Network uses a rainbow wreath, in the same vein of the infinity symbol's meaning and focus of unity. Autism-focused dates. April is Autism Awareness/Acceptance Month. April 2nd is World Autism Day. I don't know why, I blame the UN. These times are meant to raise awareness and educate folks on ASD, how they can get involved and gain a better understanding of autistic people as a whole. That's why it's less about bringing awareness, and now's the time to accept the simple truth that we exist. Introverts. I think it's no-brainer that a developmental disorder makes it a wee more difficult to socialize with other people, especially our own peers. Hence the voluntary isolation, because it's either hard to relate to others or for people to understand us. It's not always the case for most autistic people. Some are even extroverted. I, for one, can come off as an uptight prude, but once you get to know me, You'd be surprised what comes out of and in my mouth. Self-diagnosis. As much as I want to encourage people to get diagnosed by a licensed medical professional, inaccurate and even misdiagnosis is fairly common, especially with adults. Often mistaken for ADHD or dismissive as a behavioral issue. Cough, cough, especially in Black children. Cough, cough, coughity, cough, cough. Due to the lack of availability and diverse research for autism, and since it's a spectrum, it's expressed in different ways, which makes accurate diagnosis even more of a challenge. Not to mention the cost for diagnosis is outrageous, and depending on your insurance, or lack thereof, that's just another added hurdle in getting a proper diagnosis. Thankfully, the ASD community has become more accepting of self-diagnosed folks. You know, so long as you've done your own research and reached that conclusion for yourself, and not solely rely on this video, like I said, not to in the disclaimer at the beginning, yo niggas need a raid for fuck! The only other benefit of a doctor's approval would be setting up proper accommodations, though. That's mainly why I recommend getting a medical diagnosis. If you can, of course. Higher diagnosis among white males. For studies done in the United States, ASD is 4.2 times more likely to be diagnosed among people assigned male at birth, being 3.7%, than people assigned female at birth, being 0.9%, as well as a higher diagnosis within white communities compared to communities of color. Why, you might ask? Short answer is misogyny and racism. Nuanced answer, due to societal expectations of young boys typically being unruly and young girls expected to be quiet, if a boy isn't being loud, that's an easier sign that, oh, there's something not right with him. Thus, leaving girls underdiagnosed until their teens at best, or their late adulthood at worst. That's where the misconception of autism primarily affecting boys comes from. Specifically white boys. Because girls are more capable of blending into their social environment than boys are, it's even more difficult to diagnose them. Unfortunately, I don't have the time for a full biology session here because the difference goes even deeper, right down to the function of a male brain versus a female brain, but everything I used for research will be in the description if you want to keep reading and learning. Share your findings in the comments. I'd love to know. Obligatory. This video's already long enough as it is. Gotta keep moving on. Blah, blah, blah. Now, there's also a racial difference in diagnosis, seeing that white kids are typically 1.1 or 1.4 times more likely to be diagnosed compared to their Black or Hispanic peers. In recent years, the gap has been getting shorter, but speaking from my own insight, I think kids of color are less likely to be diagnosed due to a lack of differing factors. We already know the diagnosis costs a pretty penny, so it could be a financial difference, or parents and teachers mistaking the symptoms as a behavioral issue, which is very common among Black autistic boys. It could also be wanting to avoid adding yet another difficulty that their child would have to deal with in life. I'm talking about some, oh, it's bad enough you're Black, but disabled too type beat. I kind of had to deal with that myself. You don't need more things to worry about while you're trying to live. It gets complicated. In 2016, the CDC published results of the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network's findings of the prevalence of ASD among 8-year-olds within the proximity of their 11 sites in various states. The article is a fascinating read. I highly recommend it because it also proves my point further on how easily missed children of color and girls are when it comes to diagnosis. Lack of representation in media. Due to the lack of research and studies, autism has been misconstrued as the white boy's disorder, which explains why there's an abundance of white cis men on the spectrum portrayed in media as opposed to any other identity. At best, autistic people are portrayed as socially awkward geniuses to teach others to get over their ableism, and at worst, they're just fucking aliens or robots. Now, I know most folks on the spectrum feel as though they are from another planet, but you didn't have to take that concept so literal. Took it more literal than we do. Autism comes in all different shapes and colors. There is no one look. Think about that the next time you hear, "You don't look autistic." Vaccines. Okay, yet another BS thing I'm shutting down right the fuck now. Autism isn't caused by vaccines. That myth comes from a poorly done study in 1998 that linked the MMR vaccine and autism. That paper was retracted and the author lost his medical license, but unfortunately, the idea stuck around. And even if there was some weight to this, which there isn't, cannot stress that enough, being autistic isn't a disease. It just means you process things differently and need proper accommodations. It's ableist rhetoric like that is what keeps autism and medicine in a bad light. State support. The most supportive states for autistic children are as follows: Colorado, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Rhode Island, and Montana. The least supportive states are West Virginia, New Mexico, Tennessee, Nevada, Kentucky, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Nebraska, Mississippi, and Maine. This is actually putting a lot into perspective for me right now. South Park Asperger's. Now, some of y'all might have heard of Asperger's through South Park, and clearly their depiction wasn't accurate. What Stan was experiencing was closer to depression than ASD, and Counselor Mackey assumed he contracted it through a flu vaccine, yet further perpetuating that myth of vaccines and autism, and blah blah blah, something about shitting burgers and Matrix references or whatever. ASD verbiage. By now, I'm sure you've noticed how I address my fellow folks on the spectrum. I don't say people with autism or XYZ has autism, because to me, it's not something you have. It's something that you are. A large majority of us prefer identity-first language rather than person-first language. Because as autistic people, we express ourselves and perceive the world through that lens first and foremost. Now, it does vary from person to person, but that's at least how I see it. Atypical. Another term used to refer to autistic people, but due to the definition meaning irregular and abnormal, some autistic people either have an issue with it or they don't mind being referred to as atypical. It's me, I'm autistic. I don't like it. Miss me with that shit, okay? And miss me with that show too. We're all a little autistic. Don't ever say this to people on the spectrum. It's very invalidating and dismissive of our day-to-day lives. You wouldn't say, oh, we're all a little depressed or anxious to a person with severe depression or an anxiety disorder, so grant us that same courtesy. Mental health. Now, some people usually lump ASD under mental health, which isn't not accurate, but loses its nuance. MedlinePlus.gov defines mental health as including our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act as we cope with life. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. I see mental health as a dictation of the brain's health and how that can affect the body, and so on and so forth. But this wouldn't include the inner workings of the brain and its development on a neurological level. It's a common mix-up, and I can see why people think ASD is a mental disorder, but it's kinda not by definition. As we move towards the shallows, I'll further explain why it's actually a neurological developmental disorder, or a neurodevelopmental disorder. According to the Department of Public Health and Human Services in Montana, neurological disorders are medically defined as disorders that affect the brain as well as the nerves found throughout the human body and the spinal cord. Structural, biochemical, or electrical abnormalities in the brain, spinal cord, or other nerves can result in a range of symptoms. So if mental health dictates how your brain tells your body to function, then neurological health determines how the brain is able to function in and of itself. As in, how your nerves respond to different stimulation and process information, whether it's rough textures, loud sounds, or strong smells, which may affect people living on the spectrum very differently compared to those not on the spectrum. Neurodiversity. A relatively new umbrella term striving for acceptance and respect in our society, bottom text. Neurodivergence includes neurological disorders such as dyslexia, ADHD, and of course, autism. Neurotypical. A term used to describe non-autistic individuals and those who don't fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. DSM-5. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5 for the fucking sake of breath, omitted Asperger's syndrome, so those of us diagnosed as such are now under the category of autism. Now the amount of support needed depends on the level of severity. Level 1 requires support. An autistic person capable of speaking in full sentences, but unable to pick up on social cues. Asperger's would fall under this level. Level 2 requires substantial support. For the more obvious issues of communication, like using simple sentences or having greater difficulties changing their focus from one thing to another. Level 3 requires very substantial support, showing behaviors of both levels 1 and 2 but at a higher extreme, as well as engaging in repetitive behaviors, very limited speech, and rarely interacting with others unless directly approached by them. Now personally, I feel that the levels aren't able to paint a full picture of autism. It's a spectrum after all. I have repetitive behaviors and hate sudden changes to my environment, but can hold a conversation, at least for a while. Guess my level would be about, 1.5, 2.5, I don't know. Not perfect, but progress was made and can keep going. Different wiring. An autistic brain and neurotypical brain are, well, built different. Certain areas of the brain are more or less active in an autistic versus a neurotypical one. Fake it till you make it. Okay, so for this section, I just put it under an umbrella because I wanted to talk about masking and scripting. Because we gotta fake it till we gotta make it, oh boy! Masking is basically a survival method for autistic people. It's essentially studying neurotypical behaviors and mirroring it in social situations. It's also used to hide our autistic behaviors, such as stimming. Side note, remember what I mentioned about girls being underdiagnosed? Because we have like this social chameleon effect when around other girls, so we just naturally mimic behaviors of one another without even realizing it. Another form of masking is scripting. The repetitive use of certain words, phrases, sounds, or other people's speech can make up a majority of scripting, as well as lines from movies and television. Communication is just hard, and having some spare words in your back pocket or a prepared script of what you're gonna say in various situations can be helpful to fill in those gaps. Less awkward silences! Hypersensitivity. People on the spectrum not only experience hypersensitivity with their bodies, such as the 5 senses, as previously mentioned, but also emotionally. Now, I don't know where the hell people got this concept of autistic people have no empathy, we have no emotion, we can't care for anyone. I blame the autistic coded robots. It's the only rep I ever get in this day and age, I'll tell you what. But I, for one, can have a range from being majorly empathetic or just literally not having the energy to care. When I say I don't care, that doesn't mean I don't emotionally care. That just means I don't have the energy to care. I don't care. So although I might have a continuous blank expression on my face, just know I and many other autistic people are capable of caring or showing it in different ways. I myself just don't know how to do it physically and how to just show it well on my face, so you get what you get. You'll grow out of it. Autism isn't like your childhood onesie, alright? It's a neurological development disorder, and people on the spectrum remain on the spectrum. It's a common misconception that only children are autistic, as if they don't grow up to be autistic adults. There's tons of resources for kids, but once they're adults, there are far and few in between. Applied behavior analysis, or ABA therapy. This form of therapy is meant to teach autistic children, quote-unquote, normal behavior through positive reinforcement tactics, but somewhere down the line, devolved into using aversive reinforcement and electric shocks to essentially force these children to be normal. Luckily, they don't zap kids like they used to correct their behaviors anymore, but ABA is still harmful because the goal seems to be eliminating autistic traits instead of helping patients cope. The priority seems to be making neurotypicals more comfortable around us. Well, I say it should be the other way around, because forcing autistic people to suppress who they are can literally kill us. Genetic. Autism, like any neurological disorder, can form during development or from an incident during early childhood, but it's largely genetic. Fortunately, but unfortunately, the research is fairly new, but medlineplus.gov did find that ASD has a tendency to run in families, but the inheritance pattern is usually unknown. People with gene changes associated with ASD generally inherit an increased risk of developing the condition rather than the condition itself. When ASD is a feature of another genetic syndrome, it can be passed on according to the inheritance pattern of that syndrome. Which makes a lot of sense in my case, because I have an aunt who might be autistic since we do share a lot of the same symptoms and childhood behaviors, but she was never diagnosed. Now on the surface there is some credit to this, but more studies can always be done. Twins. There's been studies done in 1977, 1985, 1989, and 1995 examining the likelihood of twins being on the autism spectrum. It was found that identical twins, since they share 100% of the same genes, had a higher possibility of both of them to be autistic, while fraternal twins, who share about 50% of their genes, found that either one or the other would be autistic. In the past couple of years since then, the likelihood of autism found in fraternal twins has slightly increased, while identical twins have stayed about the same. Autistic animals? Look, alright, it's possible, if studied close enough, but due to various genetic makeup and the complexity of every animal's brain, it's more complicated to say autism can be found in animals, but it's possible. Maybe. Anyway, notable autistic names. Autism might make life more challenging, but not impossible. Just look at Susan Boyle, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Barbara McClintock, Satoshi Tajiri, Tim Burton, just to name a few. A majority of these names tend to fall either into the field of creativity and expression or science and higher education. There's been speculation that historical figures such as Mozart, Sir Isaac Newton, and Thomas Jefferson were also believed to show autistic traits, meaning that autism has been around for centuries. There just wasn't a name for it yet. There's many names that are confirmed or speculated to be on the spectrum. But for the sake of time, I gotta move on to the depths. Autism organizations that actually support autistic people. These organizations are made by autistics to help support each other, their families, and to build a greater community. Autism Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, ASAN? Autistic Inclusive Meets, AIM, Autistics for Autistics, A4A, and Autism Women and Non-Binary Network, AWN. From personal experience, I was in a tight situation and AWN was able to help me. Plus, I've been to their Autism Presents conferences before, and again, it was made by autistic people for autistic people to educate and build community with autistic people from various backgrounds. It's also a great learning space for neurotypical allies as well. The venue was extremely accommodating with dim lighting, optional remote presentations, and STEM toys everywhere. It was amazing. I really miss it. For once in my life, I actually felt like I was amongst my people. Cultural differences matter. It's a spectrum, and everyone on it comes from different upbringings that affect how they react or expected to act. Underdiagnosis is common in places where autistic traits or symptoms can be overlooked as part of cultural norms. Like take, for example, in some regions of the world, children, not just the boys, are expected to be quiet and out of the way. Or cultures where eye contact isn't as important like it is in America for some fucking reason. Autism is all over the world and can show up in different places and people. So even though autism can be found everywhere, we only ever hear about it from a narrow lens. So let's explore a bit of that while we're in the deep dark. The unheard voices. Women and non-binaries, especially of color, are some of the most underdiagnosed groups, and rarely do we get to hear their stories. Which is why I highly recommend y'all check out the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network's published works. I personally recommend the book All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism. It's an anthology of different poems, art pieces, short stories, and essays from autistic women and non-binaries of color, sharing their stories and experiences. I've been reading it for a few years now, and I have never felt more connected and seen from a piece of literature. These folks are open and unapologetic about how autism, race, gender, and their other identities intersect into their everyday lives. It is a must-read if you want to learn and understand more about autistic POCs, easily to find on Amazon. Oh, and this isn't sponsored by any means whatsoever. At this point, I'm just hyping up a great book and everyone should read it, or at least get the audio version if you're not a reader. Now this right here would be a great time for a sponsorship for Audible, but I'm not there yet. Again, not sponsored, but could be. It's just nice to hear from other people and what life is like for them. It might be similar or completely different, but I encourage everyone to widen their perspective on what life is like for others. So let's talk more about perspective as we submerge into the abyss. Actually autistic perspectives. I've written and produced a whole play about being autistic, and if you want to watch it, you'll find that in my link tree in the description. But here's a TLDW version of it. I identify as an autistic, black, queer woman. Suck it, Lily Singh. So to me, before I am a woman, before being black, even before being a black woman, I'm autistic. I see the world through my autistic lens first and foremost, which comes with the realization of what it means for me to be black and a woman, and being both is a whole nother roller coaster of concerns. Oh yeah, and being queer too, but that's not important right now. I'm conditioned to fear for my safety, both as a woman and as a black person. I've worried about not being black enough, and have been called out for acting and sounding white. I attended majority black schools and was a sheltered child, and yet I always had trouble speaking in slang, like my fellow black peers. It just didn't come to me as natural, I guess. Most people found it endearing or innocent, though. I've seen the Friday movies, I've watched the Boondocks repeatedly, and laughed at the Wayne brothers, and grew up listening to NWA. But no matter how much black culture I was exposed to, it wouldn't stick, and I constantly questioned the actions and speech patterns of my people, while being questioned myself as to, why didn't you speak as much? I don't have anything to say, is what I tell them. Was I supposed to react to something? What are they expecting from me? I was a quiet child, always a fly on the wall, always listening and observing others' actions, to try to make sense of this convoluted world around me. My grandmother always said, we all have our own common sense, but my sense was never common. I'd keep my arms upright like a T-Rex, flap the sleeves of my shirts when emotional, shut down and lose my speech when overstimulated. I fear every day that my mask will break in front of the wrong people, or I'd never be accepted by the right ones. Now, luckily, I found like-minded people and built strong bonds with them. We understand each other because no one else could. But as much as I love my autistic friends, I have never met another autistic person just like me. I know autistic Black women exist, but at times, I really do feel like I'm the only one. I have no one to relate to. I don't know how to properly reach out to people or ask if they want to be friends. Like, do people do that? I'm either overly polite or come off as obsessive. That's not my intention. I don't wish to make people uncomfortable. I put up this smug, arrogant, confident persona just to protect myself because I know I'm hypersensitive, and the fear of losing my closest friends stays in the back of my mind rent-free. I love helping my friends, but I'm always hesitant to ask for it back because I don't want to be a burden. Even friends whom I have known for the better part of my journey, who are so patient with me and I just deeply love and appreciate. They've shown their willingness to learn and reassure me that I'm not being too much, that they love me for who I am. And who I am is an autistic Black queer woman. But then again, perspective is very important to me, which is why I asked for more autistic voices to share their stories. I put a call out on Twitter and on my community posts to gather as many autistic voices as I can, and I deeply appreciate all the voices that volunteered and even those who were considering participating. So please keep an open mind while you hear their stories as well.
Because I was assigned female at birth, I wasn't diagnosed with autism even though I had shown the signs ever since I was little, but I was diagnosed when I was 15 years old. My parents keep denying it, and I told my dad how much I hate ABA therapy because of the horror stories I read online about it, and he will sometimes threatens to send me to ABA therapy, knowing full well I don't want to go there. And luckily I haven't been there. And, me being autistic explains so much, because I always had those weird little quirks, those weird little sounds and hand movements, walking on my toes, that always made me a bit of a loner, plus my excessive interest. One of my first extreme addictions was on the doll line Lala Loopsy. I knew everything about the characters. I spent every day looking at the show's wiki site and collected almost all of the toys. And then that special interest was replaced with yet another one for a preschool show called Ready, Jet, Go. And like I said, I always felt like a bit of a loner because of my weird interest, because nobody in my school likes cartoons like I do. And sometimes it feels like people only support autistics when they're palatable to them. No, autism isn't just stimming and hyperfixations. There's also an ugly side to it, like meltdowns, which I sometimes have. Not in public, though, thank goodness. I have to do everything in my power to stop myself from having a meltdown in public. And feels like autistics are so performative. They're always talking about how fake leaks are ableist because autistic people are hyperfixated on the Yellow House or whatever. Literally shut up and let autistics speak for once.
I have a neat experience when it comes to autism. Even when I was a little kid, I sort of sensed that something was different about me. In school, I was always given a slightly more different schedule than most other kids. I would always be taken to classes where I was given special activities and extra learning tasks. I never really questioned it. I always thought, okay, it's a different class time, yay. This continued throughout middle school, where I was told to take classes for kids with more impaired learning skills. They would help you with your homework and any other assignments that needed completion. We always referred to it as resources. It wasn't until I was in high school that I found out about my diagnosis, and I learned from the most informative place of all, Scrubs. Yes, the beloved TV show with a final season everyone collectively agrees didn't exist. I remember watching the episode where Dr. Cox has his friend Ron visiting town and they had their sons play with each other. Perry noticed that Ron's son organized his building blocks symmetrically and had them color coordinated, and that's when he discovered that he was on the spectrum. Not to give a whole plot summary, but the story does end with Ron accepting that his son is neurodivergent and promises to help him in any way he can. It was after watching this episode when I approached my mom about the topic, and she confirmed to me that I did in fact have autism. I eventually did more research on it, and when I read over all the symptoms and behaviors, I was like, yes! This all applies to me. I'm glad we finally have a name for it. I even remember writing a paper on my biggest fear for English class, and it was to explain how I would often feel nervous when entering a normal conversation with other people, but as long as I held up my confidence, I could leave an amazing impression. My teacher really loved the paper and thought it was very touching. On that note, I had plenty of teachers throughout grade school who treated me with so much kindness and did so much to help me with my academics. They took my autism into amazing consideration. College is when things got a little trickier. There were some impatient professors who made some inappropriate remarks about me, saying that I was quote-unquote complicated. I also had a roommate who said I was, quote, putting on an act when I was trying my best to open up about my feelings whenever we tried settling a conflict. That's not to say I wasn't surrounded by people who didn't love me for who I was and were super friendly to me, but here I was starting to realize just how much certain people won't care about your diagnosis and treat you however they want. Even after I earned my degree, I encountered a few roommates who were not respectful of my diagnosis whatsoever. They would shout at me, critique my every mannerism, send me massive text walls disparaging me, and it felt straight up abusive. But even then, I still had the support of my loved ones, including my family and my friends, and eventually I was able to break away from those people. I'm now involved in communities that include many people on the spectrum, and I get along with all of them very well. I couldn't ask for any better peers. Now, that isn't to say that I don't struggle with my autism on occasion. Sometimes I forget to complete certain tasks, and I have trouble expressing my emotions properly, but while there may be times it can be a pain, it's what has shaped me to be the person I am today.
So, one of the things that I know I haven't really been public about has definitely been how accepting myself once I was diagnosed went. Generally, when I try and talk about autism, I try to talk about it as uplifting as possible because I know with places like Autism Speaks and just with the stereotypes that are out there, a lot of depiction and education is portrayed in a negative light, and I don't necessarily want to contribute to that, so try to be as positive as possible, but getting real, I think actually accepting myself, since we're dealing with the subject of acceptance, it was hard for me because I know, as most people do, you have a certain idea of what autism is supposed to look like in your head and what individuals with autism are supposed to behave like and what the course of their life is or what it's quote-unquote limited to in accordance to, you know, what people think. And I know for me, that was when I was younger, I was like, okay, well, there's absolutely no way that I have autism, you know, like I was somebody who found out it well into adulthood. I mean, even still, even last month I was diagnosed with ADHD too. Like, this isn't something that can be overtly obvious, and I think one of the reasons why is because our society teaches you that it's something to be ashamed of. Because I wouldn't necessarily say that it's my autism or my ADHD that held me back so much as it was people being ashamed of it. Because with my parents, they didn't want me to be treated differently. And I know my mom was in, I think they called it the STARS class when she was younger. It was basically the equivalent to special ed today. And she said that they treated them so horribly that she did not want me to be in the same position. And so my parents were very, very hush-hush about it, despite my pediatrician being like, hey, you guys really need to go get her checked out. Like, she's definitely on the spectrum. And that was something that I know was hard for them to hear. I think mostly because, again, society puts forth this certain idea in your head that if you have a disability or if you have autism, you can't live a fulfilling life. And I think that that is what held me back. For me personally, my autism and my ADHD, knowing now that I have the both of them has really helped me because I know that I'm not broken. I know that my brain works differently and I'm not forcing it to work in certain ways that neurotypical people would want a brain to work. And they teach you to be ashamed of it. They're like, oh, well, if you're this way, you need to be ashamed. I mean, there's like the autistic screeching meme. There's all these things like that just make you feel if you are this type of person, like that's something that you don't want to be. It's okay to be weird, but it's not okay to be autistic. Just stuff like that. And I think it also keeps you from learning about a part of yourself because you're too afraid to. You're too afraid to entertain the idea like, hey, I'm displaying like all of these symptoms that are common among ASD, but no, I can't have ASD. Like that's a bad thing. That's not possible. And then you don't learn about yourself. You don't learn coping methods to deal with sensory overload. You don't have a word to explain why your brain's not doing what it's supposed to. And I personally think that, at least for me, being too afraid to acknowledge that part of myself and needing to learn way past my teenage years what was going on, it was difficult. And I honestly, I think that that's what held me back the most, because I know even with learning that I was LGBT, I learned that I was LGBT before I learned that I was on the spectrum because of Steven Universe, unironically, but that helped a lot and I wasn't nearly as miserable. And it's just like the missing piece was finding out, hey, you also have ASD. If I had known sooner, I definitely wouldn't have struggled as much in my adolescence. So it's not necessarily that I blame my autism. It's not that I blame my ADHD. I blame how stigmatized it is. And I think that's important to bring up with Autism Acceptance Month, because they're like, oh yeah, Autism Awareness Month. You can be aware of autism and be aware that it exists. Yeah, great job, round of applause. You didn't really do much. Like, you're acknowledging that it exists. You need to accept it. People want to be accepted. Like, that's foremost a human want, is to be accepted. If you're rejecting us because of something that we can't control and something that isn't hurting anybody, and acceptance is more powerful than awareness is, because you could be aware of something and hate it. And I think that's the case that a lot of us are seeing, like when you have, again, dragging Autism Speaks under the bus, but when you have these giant places like Autism Speaks trying to cure autism, or calling it a disease, or making it look like the family members of autistic individuals are victims when they aren't, you're not accepting. You're being aware of, and you're making these people feel worse about themselves. I guess all I'm really trying to say is being aware is one thing, but there's wrong ways to be aware. I think that it's more important to accept and have that acceptance, because it can make a world of a difference for somebody who's growing up if they don't feel like they need to be ashamed and they don't feel like they can learn about themselves in a safe environment, because that's what's going to hold them back ultimately. Everybody has their own limitations, and everyone who has autism has a different experience with it. It's not going to be the same as mine. Maybe they feel personally that it does hinder them, and that's fine. That's their personal experience. But I know for me that if I was in a more accepting environment that talked openly about it and educated people about it and didn't treat it like it was something to be ashamed of, I think that I would have had an easier time when I was younger. I don't think that I would be a D student, because if there's one thing that I've noticed, it's that I am incredibly smart. It's just that I don't learn the way that other people do. When I had college and I was able to get up and walk away, I was an A student. When I was in school and forced to sit for 8 hours a day, understandably, I was a D student. Really, all I'm trying to say is acceptance can be the world of a difference. If you want somebody to live to their full potential and be living the happiest life that they can, accept them, because acceptance is what's going to help them the most.
Hello, it's ShadeX, and I am somewhere on the autism spectrum. I had trouble in school back when I was in first grade. I was acting out in class, and during recess I was obsessed with getting Yu-Gi-Oh medallions that all the other kids had. I remember I got bullied by a kid who said there was a Yu-Gi-Oh medallion in the bushes, and I believed him, and then he laughed at me when I got into the bushes. Even worse, my teacher at the time didn't know how to deal with me having autism, so I almost got transferred to another school with kids who were more on the spectrum than me. However, However, thanks to my parents, they managed me to get the help I needed so that way I wouldn't need to transfer schools. My parents managed to get a special education teacher assigned to me who would help me do better at school. This person was really kind to me and she was way more helpful than my main teacher. Before I moved away and changed schools, she gave me a Spider-Man 2 book, which I really appreciated and still have to this day. After I moved, I was in special education for math all throughout the rest of my time in public education. My main teachers at my new school were very understanding when they found out I was autistic. The teachers were always willing to help me. Special ed was very helpful for me and I managed to succeed in school. Besides being in special ed math, I also remember being in special ed homerooms. After I graduated high school and community college, I made use of my accommodations because of my autism in hard subjects like math and physics. Because of my autism, I struggled taking time tests, so my accommodations allowed me to get extended time. It's thanks to those accommodations I was able to succeed, and also the special ed teachers that helped me. Nowadays, I don't get accommodations because I feel I don't need them, despite the fact I could have gotten them for past classes. I only needed them for math classes I struggled with. Anyway, I'd like to thank Artis for letting me be in her autism video. I wanted to share this story. This has been ShadeX, and I hope you all feel nothing but good vibes.
Hiya folks, my name's the Gladiator, or Jake for short, and for those who don't know me, it's my mission to infodump about everything Disney animation on the internet. I self-diagnosed myself as autistic about 5 years ago, and once I had, it suddenly gave me a whole new perspective on my life up to that point. My entire childhood consisted mostly of questioning why I was so different. I couldn't talk like the other kids, I couldn't even walk like the other kids. Everyone was into sports and reality TV shows, while I was still deeply obsessed with SpongeBob and Disney, as I had been ever since I could remember. The entire world seemed to be operating on a frequency I couldn't key into. This often left me feeling isolated and caused me to develop issues with self-loathing. While in college, people started suggesting I may be on the spectrum, and I spent some time looking into it. All at once, the world felt different. I still have issues feeling like an outsider occasionally, but now I know why. Finally understanding why my brain functioned the way it does made it infinitely easier to accept and love all the various aspects of who I was. From then on, I rarely ever felt afraid to just be myself. And when I entered university, that deeper understanding allowed me to start exploring aspects of my identity that I'd always tried to suppress. I started buying skirts and dresses to wear publicly, letting my more femme qualities shine through, and as a result became a much more confident and happy person. Discovering I was autistic essentially freed me from the box I thought I was going to be trapped in for my entire life. And now, not only do I have a channel where I get to unashamedly share my special interests, but I finally feel comfortable in my own skin with my own weird yet wonderful brain.
So, the story of my autism is a rather sad one. So, it all started when I was in a horrible burn accident when I was around 1, most likely 2 years old, which led to me having third-degree burns on most of my legs. When I was at the hospital, the doctors ran some tests on me, and they found that there were some things off with me, even though I just went through a traumatic event, so of course I would be acting strange, but whatever. But they said that I was not acting like the average 2-year-old at the time. So at best, they diagnosed me with autism, and at worst, they said I was mentally handicapped, to use the more politically correct term there. My mother did not take this too well, and she said, no, you're wrong. It's like, he's fine, he's special. My dad, on the other hand, was like, you know what, maybe he might be this way, so we should get him help. My mother was like, no. So, basically, for the longest time, I did not know I had autism. But I kind of knew I was different because the thing was this. I would always have a tendency to be the weird one. I would always have a tendency to not understand social cues. And it just led to a lot of awkward or very, what's the word I'm looking for here? I can't really think, it'll come to me, but I think you can get an idea what I'm talking about here. For the longest time, I was just, because of my oddities, because of my autism, I was constantly bullied. I was constantly ostracized. I was not seen as normal. I was always seen as the weirdo. And for the longest time, I did not know what was wrong with me. It would lead to a lot of depression. It would lead to me. And the thing is, it wasn't until, like, I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit further here. So basically, like I said, it would lead to a lot of awkward situations. It's really hard for me to describe in a sense like this, but basically it was an alienating experience. In fact, there were times where I would have this like monotone way of speaking and people would make fun of, oh, look at that, Burke's talking like a robot. What a freaking weirdo. And again, I would just try to chat jokes. I wouldn't understand certain jokes here and there. And it wasn't until I was 20. My mother finally came up to me and said, yeah, you're actually autistic. And I broke down in tears. Because it just explained a lot. It also didn't help that as a child I was abused. Not physically and emotionally, not sexually, thank God, but still, like, when you have an autistic child and he's been abused a lot, that kind of really does a wonder on the psyche. And it really did explain why. And the thing is, I luckily I managed to find this group of people in college who were also on the spectrum. And it really helped me help my identity. It actually helped me, like, to just find people who were just like me and to find that kind of camaraderie with them. And it really did help with my mental state there. However, I never took advantage of the my university's, what's the word I'm looking for here? Again, I apologize if I'm blinking out here. Student service. Yes, there we go. Student services. People who would actually help me with my disability, with my classes and stuff. I never took them. Because some of my teachers already looked down upon me as it was, and I feel like them knowing I had autism would make them treat me less than I already was. And so because the thing is with my autism, I forgot to mention this before, is that because I didn't have like a severe case, like I am very minor on the spectrum, people really didn't have that much sympathy for me. If you actually obviously showed to have autism, I think people would have been more sympathetic, but because I didn't have that, it was like, oh, well, fuck him, and we don't want him here then. He's just a weirdo. So because of that, I had to learn how to hide it. I had to learn how to hide my autism. Because if I hide it, people would actually respect me more. They would actually feel like, hey, this is someone who is something. He is not, to use a back of a term, a retard. Because of that, it's really hard for people to know that I'm autistic. In fact, when I tell people oh yeah, hey, I'm autistic, they're like, oh, I would never know that because I learned how to hide it. And the reason why I learned to hide it was this: I am three things in this world. This world does not respect. I'm a black man, I'm autistic, and I'm an artist. And people like that are constantly shat on. So for me, it's like I have to prove that I'm respectable. And the thing is, when my mom told me, my mom does not regret keeping it away from me. She does not regret keeping the truth of my autism away from me for the longest time. And the reason why she's done this is because she said she didn't want me to feel like I was any different from the other kids and using it as an excuse for my behavior. Now, I have mixed feelings about this. On one hand, I really wish she did tell me earlier because I really wanted I really wanted the resources to actually help me. In fact, the best I got was a speech therapist because I was trying to learn how to speak again, but I didn't get anything. I didn't get any help, so there was that. But at the same time, it did toughen me up. I know some of y'all will say oh, that's kind of cruel. That was awful. In a way, it was, but the environment I grew up in, again, I mentioned before, it wasn't a kind one. So, and yes, it was either a sink or swim. I literally had to be thrown to the fucking wolves. So, I had to learn how to survive. I learned how to toughen up. I had to learn to get thick skin. I had to learn to navigate through this cruel world. And in a way, Again, I will always have mixed feelings about this. And that's going. My mom's not going to apologize for it. And I kind of learned to accept that. So, because of this, I still have to work with my autism, even though I'm good at hiding it. Every now and then it comes up. Like I said, sometimes I won't understand a certain joke or a certain social situation. But aside from that, I guess you can say I learned to navigate well. Which kind of, again, almost makes me a little bit different from other autistic people, but what can you do about it? But yeah, that's basically what I have to say for now on that story. But I really hope that this helped for other people as well.
I was diagnosed with autism when I was 3 and wasn't really told I had it till I was 14. Growing up with it wasn't too negative, to be totally honest. Like, I had problems interacting with people and felt very uncomfortable and scared to hang out with school friends or run into people from school outside of school. Plus, I had issues getting emotionally attached to family members, but that's really it. Plus, a fun fact about me, I went to a special needs school my entire life. I never got to experience going to a non-special school. Going to a special school wasn't the best. Mainly because they treat you like a really little kid and like you're the stupidest person ever. They will scold you for dumb shit like crossing a short, non-busy street by yourself. Keep in mind, this happened when I was 12. The only good thing was it was pretty piss easy to pass tests and stuff, since it's lower grade stuff. Sorry, getting a bit off topic. Anyway, wasn't until I was 14 when it got a bit worse for me. Slowly over the years, I've become more overly emotional. I became even less comfortable around people. I would easily become more irritable over the stupidest shit. Retaining information or learning is overly complicated for me. Plus, it became a little more difficult and scary to talk or want to talk to people, including friends. It sucks because after 10 years, nothing really improved for me. I do hope that one day things will finally improve for me and that I can overcome these obstacles.
Hello everybody, my name is Justin Munoz. I am 22 years old. I am recording this audio as part of Tiny Toy Tiger's upcoming project about people on the autism spectrum. I am so thankful to have this opportunity. Just as a quick heads up, I stutter a lot when I talk, so I hope that won't be too much of an issue. I did write out an outline of what I want to say, so I hope that'll help me out here for this audio. Now, I'd like to start off by talking about when I was first diagnosed. When I was first diagnosed as autistic, I was diagnosed back in 2nd grade when my teachers started noticing my picky and introverted behavior. I was actually considered lucky to have been diagnosed when I was, since the doctor that the school referred to me was considered one of the best in the field. I also had to get re-diagnosed back in 2018 after turning 18, because I was now considered a legal adult, my medical records were considered outdated, and that was the point where I was officially deemed a high-functioning autistic. So now, the question that Tiny Toy Tiger is asking for her project is, how does being autistic affect or not affect my worldview and life as a person? To be absolutely honest, I'd say being autistic has been more of a benefit for me than a hindrance. Like, for starters, I'm very hyper-focused on certain tasks. Like, when I get started on something, I prefer to work on it and finish it rather than take a break or work on something else unless it's something incredibly boring. This is especially great for when I'm doing like school projects or my artwork. Because I want to get it done. I want to get it done rather than work on something else unless I feel like I made a significant amount of progress. Another thing is like I can remember certain pieces of information on subjects I am interested in for long periods of time. So even if they're minor, I can still remember it if the subject gets brought up again in the either the near future or distant future. I'm also prefer to be well organized with my areas, and I received special accommodation during school, which helped me out a tenfold. Now, of course, there are some downsides to being autistic that I'm sure affect a lot of people, so I'll narrow the downsides down to the ones that affect me the most. For one thing, I'm very literal-minded, so I need people to be incredibly specific with me. Like, someone will tell me to do one thing, and then they'll tell me to do another thing without saying that I need to finish the first thing first. I know that sounds like common sense, but it's very real thing that happens to me a lot, so it can get frustrating. For another thing is my voice can get really loud without me realizing it. Like I'm always getting people telling me to lower my voice even though I feel as though I'm talking normally to them. I have a habit of openly sharing my thoughts or quoting random lines from movies or TV shows I like to nobody in particular. And that's a habit I struggle with controlling even in public. I also have a habit of saying the wrong things without realizing it. So most of the time I stay quiet and keep to myself because I worry about potentially offending the people I talk to. Lastly, I'm also incredibly picky with my interests because I tend to restrict them to things I'm more familiar with. Like, for example, when it comes to video games, I tend to limit my interest to only specific genres and franchises I played before. Like when it comes to action-adventure games, I stick to Zelda, or when it comes to RPGs, I stick to Pokemon. Overall, I wouldn't say that my autism has affected me too much during my lifetime outside of the downsides I just brought up. I just kind of wish more people understood that not everybody functions the same way as they do, especially in school and labor forces where you deal with more people. Like I can understand that teachers and employers aren't allowed to ask if somebody has autism for legal reasons, but I just wish they were more open to the fact they could be dealing with somebody that has an intellectual disability. All right, and that is the end of my audio. And once again, thank you, Tiny Tony. I'm sorry, I keep saying Tiny Tony Tiger, but it's actually Tiny Toy Tiger. But thank you, Tiny Toy Tiger, for providing autistic people with this opportunity to share their stories. Thank you, and I cannot wait to see this project when it comes out.
Hello. My name is Kellodrawsalot. I'm from the Netherlands, so I apologize for my bad accent. In my 20s, I was diagnosed with depression. And during those years, my therapist said that she recognized some of my traits to her patients with autism. And she suggested to me that I should check if I have autism. And after a couple of weeks, I was officially diagnosed with autism. I wasn't too surprised because I was reading into autism in the time and I could recognize myself in those articles. But other people were very surprised about it. They didn't believe it. They thought that it was misdiagnosed. They asked, "Are you sure?" Because we have a very stereotypical view of people with autism. Because lots of people they first learn about autism through TV, the media. And they often present a stereotypical character with autism. And that's why lots of people don't recognize it when other people might have it because they don't behave the same way as a fictional character do. And that can be extremely difficult. Because when I tell people they don't believe me that I have autism or they think that I'm a special case. But when I do actually, show some traits that from autism, like memory problems, having problems with certain sounds, having some problem tics, or want to repeat something, then people get annoyed, or they think I do it on purpose, or they think that I don't remember something because I do not care about the subject, the memory, or the time, or the name, or the face. And that's very hard because that can be hurtful, since I do care about memories, I do care about certain people, I do care about certain times to meet up with people. I do care about that. I do not mean to be it on purpose and forget something on purpose. So it's very difficult because if you don't act like a stereotypical fictional character with autism, then people just think that you're doing it on purpose, or that it's easy for you to improve yourself, even though that you can't, because autism is a part of who I am, and that isn't going to go away. When I was young, I was placed into a special educational school, and it was a really bad environment because I was placed in a school with other students who had learning difficulties like me, but also students with behavioral problems. And with that, I mean students kids who were harmed their own parents, their own pets, and their own siblings. So that was not a great environment for me and the other students who had studying problems. I was aware that some of the boys in my class had autism, but apparently my my teachers never recognized it from me because, again, but I wasn't acting like the way they thought all autistic people do. They just, they saw 1, 2 autistic boys, and they thought, okay, that represents everyone with who's on the spectrum. So they just assumed that I was lazy, despite I had good average grades, except for math, because that was really difficult for me. They just thought that I had bad grades in math because I just didn't try hard enough, which is really hurtful because trying so hard, I even took special classes for math, and I did my best, but my best wasn't good enough. So they just jumped to the conclusion that I just wasn't trying hard enough because all of my effort wasn't enough for them. And I just noticed that it was very difficult for me, and I kind of hope that in the future and now that maybe people, adults and teachers would try to recognize autistic traits in girls as well, so they won't get late diagnosed like me, and maybe then those students can get the help that they need, instead of being told that they're lazy and not good enough. I don't think my autism is a problem. I think my problem is the way lots of people see autism. I think with the help of education and people trying to read into it, that will already improve a lot of things, instead of just people watching a TV show and thinking that's the way most people with autism are. I'm lucky that I have a great group of friends. My social circle is very strong. They accept me for who I am, and they also take into account that I have autism. And I also have to say that my autism helps me with my creative endeavors because I hyperfixate on certain ideas and projects, and that helps me to finish things and to start new things. So I actually think that's a blessing.
Hello, this is Toon for Thought. All throughout my life, being on the autism spectrum has caused me to always be a sort of outsider among seemingly every group I've been a part of. Whenever people at school would even say so much as hi to me, I'd completely shut them out, being too laser focused on the work I had to do, and on the side focusing on incredibly geeky things that seemingly no one cared about, like old game shows or highway signs. I'd always make a point to sit in my own little corner during study hall, just so I wouldn't be bothered or interrupted by anyone else. Sometimes I'd encounter someone in the hall who was like, "Don't you remember me? We were in science class 2 years ago." And all I could think was, who are you exactly? The school did try to put me in the social group with other people in the spectrum, but I always felt patronized by this and tried desperately to stay away from it as much as possible, as I took this as a sign that I was essentially a lesser student than everyone else, because even though they tried to tell me I wasn't, they never really elaborated on why I wasn't. Things got a little better by college. I was actually trying to find a few friends to connect with, but the problem was, I had no idea how to really approach people. Most of the time when I found the courage to do so, I would just kind of casually stroll up to anyone I saw who engaged in any interests I had, and we'd exchange numbers only for us to forget about each other in like a month at most. Why was I like this? Mostly because I felt I was being surrounded by people who were overly juvenile or just too loud for my liking, no matter where I'd go. And I think a handful of them were purposely provoking me because of this too. It gave me a certain level of cynicism in how I really look at people by default. Obviously I knew most of these people were great, and they very much had my respect, but I just had no click. Then there's stuff that I still suffer from to this day, like my crappy attention span, where I can rarely focus on a show or film on my own for more than 10 minutes at a time without having to pause and look at my phone or something, which has led to me going through media, even the stuff I genuinely love and cherish, so much slower than I want. And of course all the hand flapping, foot stomping stimming, which my parents for the longest time would constantly call me out for, saying it's weird. It was never clear in my head what was in my control and what wasn't in my control, and more importantly, how to control it. Things only really began to change for me about 7 years ago when I found this local gaming group. And from the first day I saw them, I felt like I finally found a group of people I could relate to. It was a huge relief. But unfortunately, my lack of social knowledge still loomed in the air as I'd interact. Sometimes I get impatient with certain behaviors they'd exhibit. Sometimes I would get too picky over the selection of games in mind. And I would also take issue with how slow parts like the dinner process would take. The point is, my problems didn't quite stop there. The people in that group really did help me improve my social skills over time, which I am very grateful for. And then, when I started interacting with fellow animation fans on Toon Zone and later Twitter and Discord, I would pick up on even more social lessons from those who were everything like me, and also those who were nothing like me. But, as many of my friends and mutuals among these circles would attest, I still get rather socially awkward a lot of the time to this very day, and have a distinct difficulty latching onto many social cues. What's common knowledge to you can be a foreign language to me, as I've said in the past. I can get paranoid when I see someone doesn't want to talk to me, or if I say something that may have come across as off-putting in any way, because I've always been told by my parents, if they say you're not annoying them, they're just saying that to be nice, and you actually are annoying them. You can probably see the feedback loop this devolves into. And even beyond my social habits, my mind can often get clouded up by some of the most weirdly specific ideas and details. Sometimes it's from a historical standpoint, but other times it's from a character or concept representing a set of tropes I am an absolute sucker for. Don't get me wrong, this can be great in dissecting bits of obscure trivia, as well as other productive uses like engaging in fanfic, both of which I have done. But it sucks when you know you should get these things out of your head for your own good and you just can't, you know? I can best describe being on the autism spectrum as having something to learn about yourself every day, as well as the good your habits can bring to the world. In my case, I've archived many things that very few others would have even thought of looking at, have provided some much needed comfort to some friends also on the spectrum, and have turned my very rigorous attention to detail into a high-paying career. What makes you weird can ultimately be your big ace in the hole when it comes to life. Hanging around all those people in my adult life made me realize how incredibly different everyone's experiences are, and the many ways people can mentally struggle. And if I've helped you discover something about what makes you tick just by hearing my ramble, then clearly I've done my job.
It's hard for me to speak on this topic of autism when I just recently found out myself and to just researching it, but I'm gonna try. When I was born, I had a delay of speech, which meant I didn't speak as much, or some of the words I couldn't say. I was silent a lot. And throughout my childhood, and I couldn't really smile that much. I smiled like a couple times as a kid, and it kind of went with me. I think it still it goes with me in my adulthood. Growing up in a religious household, or growing up around religion, you get this common talking point about autism and how it's a disease or it's a work of the devil and stuff. And if you have God, or if you believe in a deity or something, if you're in Christian base, it's mostly God, then you will be cured, and that autism will be cured and you'll be normal. And I find that statement not only toxic but disgusting as well, because we're all unique in our own way. Autism isn't a disease that can be cured. It's what makes some people themselves and really great people on their own. I don't want to even use special, because special can be seen when I'm around people. When someone says special, I sometimes feel that as a negative thing, because you think normal. When I think normals around people, sometimes it just means just like everyone else. Like you talk regularly, you're not that silent or stuff, and it just, I don't know, really just kind of just breaks my heart how that type of language is not only used in people with autism, but people who are LGBTQ plus. You know, if you're LGBTQ plus, you're special. If you're straight, you're normal. That's also disgusting, and plenty of phobias. When it comes to representation, I don't see a lot of people of color or black people really represented in autistic representation, and it will take time, but I think it should show that black people go through this too, and it shouldn't just be of one group of people. It should be everyone. And when it comes to representation we have now, some get it right. I think one is Andy Mack. One of the characters had, I think, autism, and he was sad that and complained that he was broken, and the friend says you're not broken. But for every Andy Mack, there's also a Girl Meets World, which handles that one very poorly. I think the episode, Artie having Asperger's, and it's crazy. It's crazy. More people will probably know about that and have a better experience explaining the episode better than I could, because if I could, my brain would hurt. So it's very hard to explain the ideas and just the experience of it when I really was never told about. I had to find that out myself, and I know it's like it's very difficult for me to think about, but I say this to many people: you are valued, and you are great just the way you are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You are not broken. And if I say we diversify it and let others see that, because everyone goes through it, I think the autistic representation, just like LGBTQ plus representation, asexual representation, anything, I think it'll get better over time. It has a lot of work to do, like many states of representation, and I hope for more throughout. Thank you, Artis, for letting me on this. Let me speak. It was hard for me to do. I'm Rod's Variety. I focus on animation, movies, film, sometimes dabble into social issues. I have a YouTube channel called Rod's Variety and a Twitter at Rod's Variety, all lowercase. And thank you for having me, Artis, again. And again, you are valued, and you are great just the way you are.
I'm Benzie Johnson Jr. I'm enthusiastic about television, and I'm also autistic. And I'm biracial. I'm half black and half white. But growing up, I've always been autistic first, anything else second. It's always been a struggle being on the autism spectrum. You're basically starting from zero and spending every day trying to gain the simplest of bearings on the world while everyone else seems to know exactly what they're doing. If you're not actively aware of your progress in that regard, it can feel like you're going crazy, always feeling like you're running further and further behind and that you'll really never catch up. Being homeschooled for a few years and living in situations growing up where I never had the chance to develop socially certainly didn't help matters. Those are years I won't get back, and experiences I'll never get the chance to have. And I'll never really learn how to live with that. I'm on a part of the spectrum that has fewer roadblocks than most. The term high functioning, while it was used in my diagnosis, isn't appropriate anymore, so let's just say I'm well adjusted to feigning a neurotypical life, at least when I have to talk to anyone. Don't ask me about whether I can get things done, be consistent with anything, manage chores, errands, or personal care, or really have anything under control by myself for more than a week at a time. But riding those short buses growing up, the social aspirant in me has always felt like I've had to dismiss those things and paper over my problems, even though I could hardly hang on to social relationships anyway. Being thrown out into the world without an instruction manual is just really tough. I've spent my entire life being thrown out into the world without an instruction manual is just really tough. Okay, third take's a charm. Being thrown out into the world without any sort of natural compass or instruction manual is just really tough. I've spent my entire life looking for something to lean on, learning through the simplistic stereotypes I saw on TV, searching for purpose. But you don't get that being mixed race. There is pretty much no one to speak to your identity, much less your experiences, and that's before you even start hoping they're not neurotypical. I am a beneficiary of white privilege, sure, but I know I'm not white. It's out of convenience, a path of least social resistance, rather than true kinship. It's hard enough trying to overcome the challenges of being neurodivergent as it is. But at the same time, I've always seemed to ask, am I really black either, in the way society and culture most often define it? I don't like hip-hop. I'm awful at sports. I'm only half black, so I can only half rap. As much as I sympathize, it can be hard for me to relate to the pain that I see so many other people of color go through, because honestly, I will likely never experience most of it. As much as I can look at my dad and know I have an N-word pass, exploring and asserting my half-blackness comes off as strange. Honestly, I feel like Twofer in that one episode of 30 Rock when he uses his pass, really. But we live in a society where you can't ignore your identity. Things you can't change about who you are do translate into measurable differences in how you will experience this world. But being biracial, I feel like I'm forced to pick a side and yet are alienated by both of them, and neither of them fully represent what it means to be me anyway. The racial disconnect of being mixed is amplified by the natural societal disconnect of being autistic and not being able to pick up on these things to begin with. At least I've had the luxury of inadvertently avoiding some of the toxicity that comes from that awareness to some extent, but I will never feel fully comfortable using a we in reference to either racial side of me, and probably with anyone who even is like me, too. So, here I am, 23, unseen and unfulfilled. Who am I has no clear answer, and it's not like I can even gut check whether that feels right or not. I feel like I haven't aged much in the past 10 years, if I'm honest. Playground days are long over, and I've been thrust into a different chapter in my life, even more frightened about underachieving it. Playground days are long over, and I've been thrust into a different chapter in my life I'm even more frightened about underachieving in. The one where you really set yourself up for the rest of your life. More friendships, romance, becoming independent. If I don't at least try and knock off this section of the life stage bucket list now, it's only going to get weirder, harder, and more awkward to do when I get older. And for all the years I've never had something to relate to in my entire life, there's a movie out there that perfectly represents my deepest fears of failure manifest. The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Nothing more needs to be said for the day I can't run to catch up anymore and I collapse into a heaving heap to stare at me dead in the face. Okay, I'm gonna do that line again. Nothing more needs to be said for the day I can't run to catch up anymore and I collapse into a heaving heap to stare at me dead in the face. I've got 16 and a half years to go, sure, but who said I could keep track of time this far?
So, my story about like how autism has sort of affected me in my life, or, you know, being born with it. Well, let's just start at the beginning. So, I myself am I call myself a weird person sometimes, but I don't think but maybe that might be because of the autism. I'm not 100% sure, but I do see myself as like an outlier or someone who just didn't fit in, especially back in middle school. So in middle school, there was a lot going on, and I just couldn't understand everything. I couldn't understand people. It was really hard to understand like anything really going on. And throughout all the stress, my dad told me, like, you know, what autism was and that I was born with it. I didn't really understand at first, but he did help me understand by saying that I'm wired differently. Like, I can't sometimes understand things, or maybe understand them in a different way. And, like, you know, I'm still doing that sort of thing, where I'm still trying to figure out what exactly it means to, like, have autism, because I can't really tell the difference between having autism or just being me as a person. But maybe that's just how it is. That's just me as a person. It's not autism. Well, yes, autism did make me who I am. And maybe, who knows, it's not really, I wouldn't say it affects me a lot. Not a lot. It does affect me a little bit. Just a tiny little bit. Like, I'm not irked by it. Like, I don't, like, I'm saying, oh, I'm a freak for having this. No, it's not that. The thing is like, it makes me overthink, and there's a lot of thoughts going through my head all the time. I get stuck in my own head sometimes. Like, God, the amount of times I get stuck in my head, just, yikes. Even if it's like, when I'm talking to my friends, I just zone out. Sometimes I'll just randomly zone out when I'm talking to people, which, if people know me, then yes, they will know that, which is why sometimes I'm quiet, or seen as being quiet. Most of the time, if I'm just having an off day, or just, I don't know, God, this is going everywhere. But yeah, if I'm having an off day, I'll just sit in my room, or just close my eyes, or look outside. Like, right now, it looks very dark outside, but to me, it's just, I don't know, it just looks nice outside. And I'll just put in my headphones and just listen, or draw. Just let my imagination take me out of the situation and just escape reality sometimes. I don't know if that's good, I don't know if that's bad. It's more or less like, think of it as like a happy place, but except you visit it more and more. Like, just randomly. Because, like, but it's also really helped me, because now I'm a very imaginative person, which, you know, it helped me with, like, seeing things I want to draw, which I don't know if it's autism that gave me this sort of skill. I wouldn't say skill, more or less, yeah, I guess skill? I don't know. To where I can look at something and somehow almost 100% draw it. I could make an example, but I don't really have an idea right now. Maybe I'll try and think of something. I have no clue. But yeah, that's basically my perspective on how autism has sort of affected my life. I wouldn't say effective, just, you know, just living with it.
Thank you all so much for sharing your voices. Links to everyone's socials will be in the description. I hope you learned something from this, or at least felt seen, and just reassured that you're not alone. There's more like us out there. Happy Autism Acceptance Month, everyone.